Hello everyone, welcome back to another conversation with Yoders Farm, and today is January the 2nd. We are already into the new year of 2020, and we are going to bring you a short podcast, hopefully catch you up a bit on what we've done the last couple of weeks, and talk a little bit more about tomatoes. Eldon has turned it over to the mere amateurs again, like he did last time. And I'm here with Dad. Hi, Dad. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm fine.
All right, late in the evening, and we're all tired, so we have to make this fairly short. What did you do today?
Today was one of those days we enjoy on the farm with lots of variety. Probably the most time-consuming was a marketing trip to Charlottesville. We have one of our outlets for our tomatoes is there. So we have been making weekly trips, or almost weekly, since we started picking at a wholesale level this last fall.
Yep, and I spent most of my day actually in the greenhouse doing tomato work as well. So, yeah, today was a tomato day, I guess.
Sort of, tomatoes are front and center. We, of course, have our animals to feed and watch over everything else around the place, but tomatoes sort of get the priority these days.
All right, so we talked last time kind of about heating and the importance of heating our greenhouses this time of the year, those kind of things. Thought maybe this time we should take a bit of a step back and talk just a little bit about tomatoes in general, what makes our tomatoes a little different, and talk a little bit about the growing process, etc. So we grow hydroponic tomatoes. Some people have a hard time saying that word. We've heard hydraulic tomatoes and different variations. Hydroponic tomatoes. Different variations on that fancy word. Would you want to give us a brief definition and just elaborate on our tomatoes and what makes them different?
Hydroponics it's a growing method that's been around since the Garden of Eden and the mist going up and watering the garden. Had the ancient Babylonians with their hanging gardens on the walls of Babylon. They were hydroponic gardens. Much more recently, South Pacific, World War II, the troops were growing some of their produce and greens on the South Pacific Islands hydroponically. The Dutch were instrumental in more modern hydroponics as they reclaimed some of the sea land. The soil was too salty to grow crops in, so they worked hard with hydroponics, and actually some of the varieties of tomato seeds we're using now were Dutch in origin. The one we really like that we still have available is the Trust tomato, which was a De Ruyter seed company tomato straight from Holland.
So, and hydroponic basically means that it gets its nutrients from the water.
That's correct.
The liquid. So our tomatoes, we have them in pots. The pots are not filled with soil. They're filled with coconut fiber product called coir, and the roots are basically rooted in that like they would be in soil, and each pot gets watered from above. The fertilizer's in the water, and it makes the plant grow. That's kind of the long and short of it.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. And a few differences with hydroponic production versus soil production. As you grow your garden, for example, and you add amendments like leaves or manure or fertilizer, etc., you're feeding the soil in turn feeds the plant. With hydroponic production, we need to actually feed the plant itself. So it needs to be carefully monitored. You can get things out of whack fairly quickly. But yes, we're feeding the plant itself, and of course responding to issues that we see, whether plant color, plant health in general, or tissue samples, or we monitor our fertilizer water as well to try to stay on track.
So yeah, if you're growing in soil, you have a bit of a buffer. You know things don't change quite as quickly. But when everything is being supplied through these little watering systems, then yeah, things can change rather quickly, and then it can quickly make a difference in the plant. How many times a day would you say our systems are watering?
We have several different kinds of systems. The most advanced probably is the solar grow, which is responding. It feeds based on the amount of solar radiation. So on a bright sunny day, we'll feed many times. And you'd want to have per plant probably at least a gallon and a half or so in one of those pots with 2 plants in it. On a cloudy day, you might only feed once or twice. As photosynthesis happens, of course, nutrient uptake is also stimulated through the roots. So the sun is what makes the difference.
And of course, in longer days on into the summer, you're going to be feeding your plants more, and it's season dependent as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we have there are 2 tanks that we get our mix from. One's a nitrogen tank, one's a fertilizer tank, and that balance. And talk a little bit about that, and talk about your EC meter.
Yeah. So our fertilizer, we don't mix the complete fertilizer that goes directly to the plant. The fertilizers would, for one, it would require a very large tank. The other is that fertilizers don't always get along so well together in the concentrated form anyway. So we would have the 2 tanks, as Lowell said, one with the calcium nitrate, which is the nitrogen source, and then we have a hydroponic fertilizer in the other tank that both of these concentrates are metered in proportionately as the water flows out to water these plants. We run ours at about 2%. There's infinite adjustments that you can make with both your concentration and with your ratio that you feed. What we're doing, there's science behind it. Be honest with you, it gets to be kind of like feeding cows. We make sure they clean up what they're supposed to every week, and that's usually working out pretty well.
And the EC meter.
The EC meter, basically, it's one simple measurement of electroconductivity, and so when I have my ratios right, I'm feeding an EC level of about 2.8 to 3.2. And that's just a measurement of the amount of conductive solids that are in the fertilizer solution, which is just a measurement of the fertilizers that the plant is getting.
Yeah, I don't even pretend to understand all that. I just thought it was interesting. We were playing around with the EC meter today. It's something that we actually use, fairly regularly, just checking up, making sure that once you mix a new batch of fertilizer, that the ECs are right, and if the plants are looking a little bit off, that's the first thing we probably check is the ECs, and we got the fancy meter and plunge it in and see where the blinking light goes. So we aren't obviously growing some of the varieties that most people are familiar with in their gardens. We've played around with many varieties over the years. I believe Granddad did actually start growing Blitz tomatoes way back when.
That's a name I remember from back in the 90s.
I'm not sure if he actually started with that, but yeah, and I guess, probably there's been ongoing breeding and research and so forth, so the varieties have shifted some over the years. Right now, you mentioned we're growing one called Trust. We really like that one. It's been just a very consistent, solid tomato for us. I remember we used to have a partial row of the little Tricia tomatoes. It was a cluster tomato, nice. It was actually a very firm, a little bit like the BHN 589 tomatoes that we have now. And we even had some yellow ones back in those days.
That's right. We've grown Big Dina.
That's right.
There are a number of varieties that could be grown in a garden. One thing we like to use in the greenhouses, because we have a long growing season, We like to use an indeterminate tomato, which that means it's continually setting new fruit, blooming and setting new fruit as it's ripening the fruit that's already set. Determinate tomatoes, by contrast, are more about doing things at the same time. In other words, you get a lot of blooms, your fruit set, and then you have your tomatoes kind of all coming in a much shorter window. Indeterminate's good for us because it spreads things out and gives us that growing tip to work with and train.
Yeah, so that's what I was actually working at today was leaning and lowering. Basically, you have to move the plant along your trellising system, and these are all supported from cable, suspended up above each row, basically, and the plant is clipped to a twine, and then the twine is hooked, basically hooked up to that cable. And usually every 2 weeks, we try to, if the plant's growing, we lean and lower. So you take off maybe 3 to 4 leaves on the bottom, 4 or 5, depending on how much it's grown. Drop the plant a little bit so it doesn't poke up past the cables, and this makes everything more manageable. So that's what I was working on today. And then I usually work on clipping at the same time, bottom leaves, clipping, and then you talked about training. Basically, you have this growing point, and then suckers form off of that. And since we want the thing to keep growing straight, and we want one growing tip, basically we have to sucker every week or two, and basically means just popping them off. Usually 3, 4, 5 per plant per time. A little hard to explain exactly what a sucker is over the air, but anyway, it's a little unneeded thing that keeps the tomato from getting all bushy.
Keeps it focused.
Yeah, keeps one growing tip, and basically we're just stacking tomato clusters up this plant. If everything's doing well, you don't miss one. You have 6, 7, 8 clusters of tomato at a time, from little marble or smaller, actually blooming, and then marble size, stepping on down, golf ball size, to a nice, hopefully half-pound cluster of 3 or 4 or 5, mostly red ones at the bottom. So that's
the goal.
The goal, and how it's supposed to look doesn't always look that way.
We're looking at blooms up top. We talked a little earlier about, sort of monitoring the plant to see how its health is. Well, a good bright yellow bloom is a good indicator that things are trending well. It also tells you better have your bees working or getting that pollinated, so it can go ahead and set that little pea-sized tomato.
Yeah, and we use bumblebees to do that. They work better inside a greenhouse than, say, honeybees. They somehow get oriented a little bit better in a smaller space. So we just buy those, get them shipped in, and generally use a couple per house, especially during the winter months when there's not as much airflow. Tomatoes can pollinate with wind and air movement too, but our fans aren't running as much in the wintertime. I think we may have touched on that in another podcast, but anyway, bees are important in the greenhouse. And then I don't think we mentioned, but each of those clusters, they get very heavy, especially this time of the year, or they're not as strong, I guess, this time of the year. So we put a hook on each one of those, hooking back to that same twine that supports the plant. So each tomato cluster actually gets a hook, and that's part of the ongoing vine work that we do. So we've talked through sort of how we grow them. Would you say it's usually 3 months or so from the time we start our seeds till we would be picking? Of course, that's a bit weather dependent.
Yeah, it depends. Like you say, in the fall, it's a little bit disconcerting to a living plant to take it from longer day length down to shortest days and then turn it around and start to stretch them out again. From here on out, we're past the equinox, so day length's increasing. I think our plants just tend to do better when it's a little bit more sunlight every day and days getting a little longer. That's sort of the way they naturally would grow.
So yeah, we stagger. We have 3 greenhouses here. We stagger our plantings basically different times. We obviously don't need 3 greenhouses full of tomatoes at every time of the year. So have kind of a fall house and then an early spring house and then another house. We sometimes grow some heirloom tomatoes. Another side note, we have found that these, with a few tweaks, we can also grow cucumbers with the same mix. We can grow them hydroponically, and they can actually be quite productive with a little additional fertilizer. And this year we've actually played around with some squash too that seem to be doing pretty well. And I think there's an eggplant or 2 over there for our own use.
That's right.
And,
We've done peppers. Peppers do pretty well.
A lot of interesting things you can grow this way, but of course tomatoes are kind of our bread and butter, and that's what we can grow during the winter time. So that's what we do. So last thing we'll touch on here in regards to tomatoes, I'll talk a little bit about marketing. We try to have our tomatoes available starting about the 1st of November, right after the maize closes, and all through the winter, as long as our plants are doing well, which usually we have at least enough to supply our little farm store here. And then we try to have them on in to July ways, about the time that field tomatoes and garden tomatoes are coming in. And then the greenhouse get very hot, and the tomatoes, it's just more challenging than growing them inside. And that's usually about the time we wrap them up, clean out the greenhouses, and sterilize things, get ready to start another growing season. So talk a little bit about marketing. I mentioned we sell quite a few right here at the store, walk-in customers, and where the rest of them go.
Yeah, marketing is a fascinating thing, and if anyone wondered about raising produce, generally good advice is to sort out your markets first. Well, ours have kind of evolved along with the rest of our operation. We do have several distributors we've been working with for numerous years, and we've been blessed in that regard, and we have marketed other products. In other words, our strawberries are going the same directions as the tomatoes. In the past, we have grown some sweet corn on a wholesale level for several years that followed the same channels. So that's been very helpful to have some consistent places to move those tomatoes along. Not too many just individual stores, especially not locally. We're happy with folks coming right out here to the farm. There is a store in Madison Heights, several that we supply in other areas. But marketing is a little tricky. We do want to prioritize our farm store right here at the farm. We'd like to have folks coming out here. This gives us an opportunity to market our seconds, our slightly defective or not quite as nice tomatoes. We can give you a
smaller
size. We can give you a deal on those. But yes, marketing, to balance production and demand, not have too much of one or the other can be a little tricky because we're not dealing with exact measurements here. It has to kind of be done on the fly.
Yeah, we've kind of found a niche. Some CSA people have used our tomatoes in the past, and then in the fall, but especially early spring when some other produce stands get started, March and April, farmers market type places. A lot of our tomatoes would go those directions. We've sold tomatoes, well, a lot of them north to Charlottesville, and then a few would end up even in D.C. by a couple of various channels, markets, and through the local food hub in Charlottesville, and then some go west, Roanoke accounts to a distributor over in those parts, and yeah, that's about it. All that I can think of off the top of my head.
And demand is really, really good right here, particularly when we have lots of traffic in for those strawberries. So that's a very symbiotic relationship there. Strawberry pickers seem to like other colors of red as well, so they take lots of tomatoes home with them.
Yeah, and we have people who kind of make it their weekly stop to swing by the store, especially through the winter time and spring, when they might grow tomatoes themselves at home in their garden, but they have no access to a high quality, really good tasting tomato in the wintertime, and so they swing by and get their weekly allotment. So, all right, I think that probably covers about as much about growing tomatoes that we want to get into tonight.
Probably so.
I think you have a fire or two to fix, and I have a painting project I'm working on at home, so it's about ready for the second coat. Thanks everyone for listening, and don't know if it will be us next time, or maybe Eldon will grace us with his presence back in the studio. But until next time, whatever he says at the end of the podcast, you should do that. And I don't know why podcasts always say you should subscribe and do all that stuff, because every podcast always says that. So I'm not going to say that. I'm going to find the little red button right here and
have a happy new year,
stop.
everyone.
All right. Happy New Year. See ya.